Welcome to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds, featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I am your host, Larissa and Dr, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team, here to lead conversations and to shine a light on phenomenal educators and those that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. Maybe you've been listening for a while, or this is your first episode. If you like what you hear, would you do us a favor by rating and reviewing us on iTunes? This is a fantastic way to tell us you enjoy what we are creating. Also, if you want more MTSS resources, sign up for our weekly newsletter using the link in our show notes, and check out our website for all the blogs and guides you would ever need about MTSS. While social emotional skills and emotional maturity play a crucial role in building self-awareness, empathy, and resilience among students, many teachers maybe feel it adds to their already overwhelming workload. To help us explore these challenges and discover practical solutions, we're joined by Dr. Julie Sauve from Harmony Academy, which provides a digital no-cost resources for students and educators to support their social, emotional, and academic development. So we're so excited to have her here on the podcast to chat about this. Welcome, Julie.
Well, thank you very much, Larissa. I'm grateful to be here with you today.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to first just have you kind of give a little bit of an intro of yourself and your background, and maybe share a little bit about your own personal journey into that world of social emotional learning.
Wonderful. Well, again, thanks again for having me, and I'm excited to share a little bit about this. And I think that honestly, my journey starts really young in terms of the fact that my mother was actually a teacher, and I spent many a days after school in her classroom waiting for her to wrap up all the things that teachers do. And I always knew I wanted to be a teacher because I absolutely loved being with her in her classroom. And, hearing stories from my peers when I was in middle school or high school saying, oh, your mom was my most favorite teacher I ever had in second grade, so I certainly always knew in terms of teaching that my mom had something very special and that she made students feel very cared and valued and loved within her classroom. So fast forward, a couple of decades from when I was a little girl there in that classroom with her, I began my teaching career, and I was in the classroom for about a decade. And I was a high school teacher, and I also then was an instructional coach for a couple of years. And how I made that transition 100% is related to the fact that as an educator myself, I very much felt like I didn't have a lot of the emotional regulation skills or some of the social skills I needed to really thrive within the classroom. And I'll unpack that a little bit more, but essentially, I spent some time as an instructional coach when I left the classroom because I was really interested in helping support educators and helping develop educators. I would often ask my students when I was a brand new teacher, like, who are some of the most amazing teachers in the building and what are the qualities about them that make them amazing? And it's interesting because there were always these 3 or 4 same teachers that all the students over the years would always talk about. So I have to be like, what's going on down at that teacher's classroom that's making it so the students love being in their class so much? And as I got to know those teachers and as I got to know more from the students, if I'm being honest, it was never about like, oh, so-and-so is just really good at teaching math, or, oh, so-and-so is just really great at helping me, conjugate a sentence. It was never that. It was always that, so-and-so really makes me feel seen. Or I don't know exactly what it is, but when I walk into so-and-so's classroom, I feel really valued and supported, or I feel like I belong. Right. Yeah. And so it kind of got me to start thinking about like, what are these kind of tacit or unspoken qualities that teachers have that kind of almost seem like they're magical or happening in the background, right? Where you're like, oh, that teacher just must have something about them that makes them special. I was really interested in like, is that the case, or is it actually that we as educators can develop those types of skills so that all students can have those types of learning environments?
Yeah, because I want to stop you right there because I want to talk about this before I let you go on.
Yeah.
Because that idea that there are teachers, you think that there's something magical about them. And I used to call it like some people just have like a with itness that they
Right.
have in teaching. And so, is that idea of you have it or you don't? And can you ever develop that and thrive? Like I've always kind of wondered about that question. So I love that you're bringing this up. So feel free to continue. We'll
Love
touch
it.
back on that.
Perfect. Well, I think that, I certainly felt like, though maybe there were certain areas that I did well, I also had a lot to learn, So,
Mm,
in part of my coaching, going back to working with the teachers, it was interesting too, because, working as a district level coach, a lot of times I'd be assigned to a teacher who was really struggling in their classroom. And most likely, most of the time when teachers were struggling in their classroom, it's really because there was a lack of connection with their students. But of course I'm tasked to go in and do things like help this teacher, use more engaging strategies with this math curriculum or whatever the curriculum may be. And, a lot of times I would sit down with the teachers in our coaching sessions afterwards. And they would say to me like, Julie, I'm sure that this is a great curriculum that the district is wanting me to adopt. And I'm sure that, there's probably a lot of good stuff here. But I'm so in over my head right now with everything else I have to do with teaching that I don't even have the capacity right now to think about learning something new. I'm literally just surviving day by day and trying to
mm,
keep the kids from like misbehaving in class, or trying to keep the
yeah.
kids just even excited to come to school, that I don't even like, literally the curriculum was secondary. And, I think that that's really what opened my mind to this question of like, well, what are the skills that I'm going to include myself in this? I don't really feel I was taught when I was trained to be a teacher, to create the right types of conditions where students walk into a learning environment and they thrive. And I think from the outside looking in, like you're saying, it seems a bit magical. Like, oh, how do those teachers have that with it? Is how do they have it all together? And maybe some are more naturally inclined than others to be more naturally like socially or emotionally inept. But the truth is, these are skills that teachers can learn. And so that's where my exploration of educators' social and emotional development, educators' well-being, really started. I went back to graduate school and had the opportunity to study with an extraordinary woman up in British Columbia and learn about what it looks like to start integrating, being intentional about teaching teachers these skills.
Mm,
Not because teachers, aren't well prepared. It's just that this is often not something that we're taught, and we're expected, almost like you just naturally have it when you go into the classroom. All of the
yeah.
social emotional skills you need to cope with the challenges of the classroom. And the truth is, we aren't ever taught these skills. And so we
Yeah.
need to be taught them.
All our listeners will probably tell this is why I wanted to have you on the podcast to talk about this. And I'm very passionate as well as a former instructional coach of like, really, how do we support teachers in providing them the resources, the training that they need to thrive? Because when teachers thrive, students will thrive. And so I love that you shared that tidbit and that experience. And I think that there's probably a lot of teachers that can relate, or just educators in general, because many of our listeners are district or school leaders,
Mhm.
and they started probably in the classroom of and understanding that, like, that thing of like, what is it that I don't have right now that I need to make this environment? Or even maybe those years where you felt underwater because you're learning a new curriculum and you have a tough group of kids, or there's all these other factors that go into it. So I think that, like, kind of coming back to that idea that you were talking about, that situation with the teacher feeling underwater, for many educators, that the developing those skills outside of, just teaching the curriculum, developing the skills for themselves can sometimes feel like this extra thing that they don't have the time or
Mhm.
capacity for, or even how do you, like, it doesn't slow down enough for you to go, how do I practice emotional regulation when everything is chaos, right? And
Right.
so, especially if, since they don't have that right training, how do you respond to those concerns of educators? And, maybe what is your perspective on kind of how do we integrate that? What are some practical ways that we can help get teachers that kind of training?
Well, thanks, Larissa. And I wish there was an easy answer to your question. I wish that they could be like, well, just do this, this, and this. And all of a sudden, ta-da, teachers will be thriving in their classrooms. They will be emotionally well, and they'll be able to manage it all. And so I know that, like, right now, we want to walk away hopefully with like having maybe identified or sharing some strategies that can actively support and help teachers in the classroom now. 100% that's part of the solution. But I do also want to put out there that we need to be careful about this narrative so that it doesn't become, well, now there's one more thing that teachers have to do, which is also take care of themselves.
Yeah.
Because then all of a sudden now self-care is another thing on your plate. And you're
Oh,
like,
right.
are
Yeah.
you kidding me?
Okay. I'm laughing because it's like, I remember these conversations of, it was during, during COVID times and you're remote teaching, and it's like, here to make sure this all happens. And don't forget to like, here's a list of self-care things you can do. And I'm like, oh, good.
Right.
Another thing to add to my schedule.
Exactly. And without being given time or space, maybe from your school leaders to like actually integrate those things into your day. Right. And so I do want to like really name that so that, for all of the teachers specifically that are listening, I want to name that because it's so important that we acknowledge that there are elements within our system that need broader support. And that ultimately, if we're talking about providing a space where educators can feel well and fully supported and have the emotional capacity that they need to cope with all of the many stressors of teaching, we do need to look to our building leaders and our district leaders and our state leaders to find ways where they can change maybe the system a little bit or change find some ways to build educator capacity rather than continue to put things on. And that is, I recognize, really complex, but I do want to name that.
Yeah.
I think that where it's the challenge is that those are the long-term changes that are kind of out of our control as a teacher. And I think one of the things I've had to learn and that's where I struggled a lot was this, just like I was so stressed out and emotionally burnt out, in part because I didn't have the capacity to give my 100% all the time to every single student, right? But I wanted to because I believe that's what that they deserved. And I did have to learn very much by trial and error that if I'm trying to always give so that my students can thrive, slowly, my ability to do that continues to dwindle. So I have to kind of, rather than, I had a teacher that said to me right now, Julie, I want you to imagine you're running a marathon. This is not a sprint. And I think that we can look at it that way to think, what are the things that I can do on a daily basis to perhaps preserve some of my well-being, recognizing that that's going to enable me to be a better teacher 2 weeks from now if every day I'm putting a little bit into my reserve.
Yeah.
If every day I'm taking a little bit of time to be very intentional and say, this is my time and space, and it's okay that I'm going to disconnect my teacher brain and not worry about my students for the next X amount of minutes or whatnot. Or, a good example would be like, I always made sure, this was a big changer for me. Like I made sure that I didn't have students in my room during lunch. And it was disappointing at first to the students because they're high school kids and they're like, we used to be able to sit and have lunch in the teacher's room. And I'm like, I'm really sorry. I need that time for me, for just quiet and care. And that's like one small example. But I think that those boundaries and finding times where it's okay for us to step back and say to our students, like, hey, I need to refuel myself a little bit right now. So give me some space.
Yeah. I think, we've had some different people on the podcast talking about like teacher well-being and how to like support teachers and talking about time, like how helping teachers learn how to structure time for productivity. So thinking about different ways, not only boundaries, like protecting that space of like eating lunch by myself sometimes, or, setting a timer for myself of 30 minutes of solid productive work during my plan time so that I knew that I would get done the things I did, and that was like one thing I could control. Like there's so many other things I couldn't control as a teacher, but how I used my time was my free time that I did have. The limited free time you have as a teacher was really essential. So
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you saying like kind of being mindful of what you can or can't control. Cause right, like that's a genuine life skill that we can all have to help cope with like the stress and anxiety. Is a lot of times we have stress and anxiety over the things that simply are not in our control.
Yeah.
And so to find those things that you can have some control in and make the changes that you need on that daily basis, to whether it be carve out time for yourself or identify what
Yeah.
at least it is that you need, that you are in control of, that you can give, is certainly a step in the right direction.
I really like the idea of like thinking as a teacher or as the people in the classroom, like what are the things I can control, and how can I, make that a little bit better? Because, yeah, I mean, there's so many things in our daily life we have no control over. So,
Right.
yeah, yeah, and that's a great skill. Honestly, that's a great skill to even like work with. I was always reminded that we would do a lesson with students about your local locus of control. And we
Uh-huh.
were talking about like what are the things you can control? Like, hey, you can't control your neighbor, but you can control how you respond, those kind of
Right.
things. And that's such a great life skill. I think I sometimes return to that as a grown adult on my own.
Oh,
So
definitely. Again, these are life skills, that fortunately we are hopefully providing space for students to practice within the classroom. It's this little like mini world in which they get to have hopefully a safe place to practice, but the ultimate goal being that they're turning around and then having these skills that they can use
yeah.
outside of the classroom.
Well, and that kind of leads me to that next question of the strategies and practices that maybe are effective in helping educators develop their own sort of competencies in this area, even before they're teaching to the students. Because I know that there are things there's like, man, this is really hard. I feel really like rote in teaching this slideshow,
Hmm. Hmm.
when it's not something I actually practice. So what are the strategies that are helpful or most effective in helping educators develop their own competencies?
Okay, well, I think, again, it's complex, and I think there are a lot of ways that we can go about it. I think, again, like you'd mentioned, like looking at it from that leadership perspective, that oftentimes, the initiatives that are put in the classroom are things that the teachers themselves weren't a part of the conversation. Um, and I think that that's critical for us to continue to put ourselves in teachers' shoes, regardless of whatever role it might be playing out. And remember our days in the classroom if we're no longer in the classroom. I think too, like, what's coming to my mind right now is just the importance of like that self-motivation theory, right? That like our building leaders are being mindful of creating spaces and opportunities where their students or their teachers can have autonomy and can have their voice being heard within the school system. A space where teachers feel belonging in
Mhm.
the school-wide community, right? So that they can feel well. And then also, are they feeling competent with what they're doing? And I think that that speaks to, rather than just being handed something as a cookie cutter and saying like, okay, well, now you have to do this and deliver this to students, where can we allow teachers to have some of their own creativity in helping their students, whatever curriculum it may be that they're working on. And I think that's actually a really great place for me to, highlight how that's one of the things I absolutely love about the Harmony Academy curriculum. But when I was looking for positions, I really was honestly so excited when I saw that Harmony was hiring a couple of years ago, because I knew what a phenomenal program it was, not only because they have so many no cost resources, but I absolutely loved that one of our core, we call them everyday practices, and it's one of our core components of the curriculum. So yes, we do have, kind of a very well organized year's worth of lessons that focus on developing students' social and emotional academic skills. And that's a really important part of the curriculum. But my favorite part is our everyday practices. And they were designed to help educators have the resources they need to take practices they're probably already doing in the classroom. But I always say, like, imagine that you're just being a bit more intentional about expanding those relationship building or those social and emotional skills within those practices, right? So like, it's not a perfect solution by any means in terms of helping with teachers' time, but I do think it's a way to help in that, rather than feeling like, oh, well, here's this, social and emotional and relationship building curriculum, and now you have one more thing on your plate because, the district is telling you have to adopt this curriculum. It's more so helping. One of my roles as an implementation specialist, and then with the professional learning, is to help educators make it their own and to say like, okay, so you're probably already doing some sort of morning circle time. right? Or you're bringing your students together in some sort of community every day. So here are some really research evidence-based strategies that you can infuse into that circle time so that students are being given intentional practice to every single day to practice things like communication skills, to practice community building and relationship skills, right? Ultimately, the hope being then that on that doing those daily practices every day is going to ultimately build a more happier, positive community within the classroom, which we know is related to supporting educator well-being as well as student well-being, right? We also know that it's related to promoting students' academic outcomes because students are more likely to thrive academically in a classroom where they feel safe and cared for and part of the community, right? Where they feel they're surrounded by healthy relationships. So it's interesting because it's complex. It's not easy, but I do think that to talk to your point about the time that you said is there's almost like an upfront investment and possibly maybe some changes in some practices. But the truth is the dividends will be that you will hopefully have more time to focus on academics because you have less behavioral problems in your classroom,
Yeah.
right? Because the students they have more social and emotional skills to resolve conflict with one another, so conflict may not even be something that is coming to you as the teacher. You don't have to stop and take time to do conflict resolution because the students, maybe they already figured it out on the playground before they came back in from the playground. And you didn't even realize there was an issue because the students now have these skills to cope with that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's not a fix all. I'm not saying that this is going to solve every challenge or problem within a
Yeah.
classroom, but I think that it is important that we be intentional about letting students practice these skills so that when they're in those times, whether it be in the classroom or beyond in life, they've had safe places to regularly practice. And that's ultimately what Harmony's everyday practices are.
Well, I like that idea of teachers making it their own because I think that sometimes, I worked with many teachers that were like, this is, kind of rejected canned curriculum in any capacity. So they're like, well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do my own thing. And I think though, is really having that autonomy to make the decisions around, I know the students in my classroom or this group of students needs this kind of thing, this group of students. And I think that that's the part where that is the part of the joy of teaching, right? Is you taking your experience and your knowledge, and your expertise and applying it to a group of students. Like that is the act of teaching, is really like, what is it going to make this understandable to them? And so I like that idea. And, I think for leaders that are listening, really having that perspective of what are we doing in that area? Or are we intentional about it enough that it can infuse into the everyday work of educators? Because I do think that there is that perception from teachers that, oh, here's an SEL lesson or here's a social skills lesson that I have to do, and it's another thing. But when it's embedded into the everyday work, right? If you're already doing a morning meeting and here's a strategy or here's an activity that you can do in that time, it kind of infuses naturally rather than it feeling like a separate thing. And I think personally, I probably struggled with that. And there were times where I was like, I'm not going to do this lesson because it seemed silly or it seemed really out of touch of what my students needed in that moment or that day. And so I do think when it's like everyday practices rather than some standalone kind of thing, it makes a lot more sense in context. Especially if the teacher is able to make those decisions themselves.
And thank you for pointing that out. And I do want to emphasize that it does take both. It's a both. It's a yes and to both.
Yeah.
Where I think that doing those weekly lessons certainly may have a place, but the real cool thing and the creativity that we can bring alive, hopefully, and really make it a lived experience for the students in our classroom is to bring it to life beyond just the weekly social or emotional lesson, right? So the idea being, and I think that that's probably where the field is headed in terms of recognizing how do we make it very explicit and help kids understand that we're learning these skills such as collaborating or problem solving or active listening or making amends if we are in a difficult situation. We're learning these things and they are applicable to when we do group work or when
Yeah.
we are out on recess with one another. They're applicable to literally every moment the way we are with one another in the classroom. And so I think that
Mm.
my guess is that in the field, we'll start seeing a shift more towards an emphasis on how can we integrate this into other academic areas, but making sure that we're still being mindful and explicit.
Yeah.
So for example, we have one of our units is all about problem solving with one another, right? And there we have these weekly lessons, and they're really awesome. But what's really cool is when we've seen teachers start taking the strategies that are taught in these weekly lessons, like for example, our Step It Up problem strategy, and saying, okay, let's use our Step It Up problem strategy while you're collaborating right now on these word problems in math, right? Or, oh, okay, remember last time we were doing our social emotional lesson, we were talking about perspective taking. Well, let's continue the conversation about perspective taking or empathy as we're talking about these characters that we're studying in our ELA lesson, right? And that's where I think a lot of that creativity that the teacher can come in with to help children and parents and leaders and all of us remember that the reason that we're focusing on these skills is because they help students in all aspects of their life. It's not
Mhm.
in isolation, right?
Yeah. I think, and that's actually a really great word, because I do think that sometimes when we think that this work is done in isolation, we actually like we miss the application part, right? You're not,
Right.
and and this is a great sort of analogy or like an example of this, right? Like I used to try to teach grammar outside of the context of my students' writing, just like understanding what a
Mm-hmm.
verb and noun and all these things are, but not in the context of how it's applied. And I do think where when we take what they're learning and apply it immediately and apply it in a context that makes sense to them, like that's going to stick more than if we just do this random lesson on a Thursday about collaboration, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's the thing that we miss sometimes if we just are focused on, oh, here's this new weekly lesson about SEL that we
Right.
need to do in homeroom, right? Like we
Right.
miss how do we apply it? And because that's where honestly that student, it's not going to stick unless students have the
Right.
opportunity to practice those things,
It
right?
needs to be practiced every day, and that requires us as teachers to be mindful and intentional about where we're highlighting that it's happening,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, exactly. It's not like oh, well, we did our social emotional lesson. Okay,
Check.
check,
Done.
check. I don't have to. Oh, remember how we did this? Let's say we did a lesson about sharing, right? Oh, okay. Well, we already did our lesson about sharing. Okay, we don't have to talk about that till next week on Wednesday afternoon. And now I'm going to put my curriculum back up on the bookcase and check, did that. But it's more so like, okay, well, where are all the opportunities on a daily basis where you could point out to students when they're using that skill in the
What,
classroom?
right?
Like
That's the
literally, there's
deeper,
hundreds of them.
right? That's the deeper learning, right? Like I taught a lesson about commas and I never had my students use commas in a sentence. Like, again, when they're
It
writing,
doesn't
like
stick.
that makes no sense. I love talking about this because I do think that, there's so many misconceptions about SEL and about social skills. But the thing about, as an educator, I have a deep understanding that so much of what my students do, right? Like especially as an English teacher, so much of what we learned about under comprehending literature is
Mm-hmm.
so applicable to their life, right? Learning how to find theme and summarizing, and because it's about how they think, it's about how they interact with information. And so I think in the same way, it would be a disservice to students to not have provide them opportunity to apply something or even point out of like, hey, I see you doing group work and you're collaborating, you're applying these collaborative skills. That's
Right,
awesome,
right.
right? Yeah.
Pointing out that relevancy so
The
that they're like,
relevancy.
oh, that's why we're learning that because it applies to these other aspects of my
Right.
life,
I mean, how
right?
many times do we go back, we're like, how does algebra apply to my life right now? I mean, I think there's so many times we think like that, but really understanding, providing students. And I did this a lot. I think I had to do this a lot in middle school because they're like, why do we have to learn this? And really trying to provide them context and relevancy. This is why this is relevant, connecting the dots for them sometimes because their
Absolutely.
brains maybe are not at the place where they can connect the dots, and really trying to give them go behind like, what's the why? Why are we doing this?
Exactly. What's the why? What's the
Yeah.
why, I think. And not only to like bringing it back to the teacher, like not not only so our students understand the why, right? So they understand why we're asking them to do what we're asking them to do. But also then I think going back to the teacher, that's part of, to me, one of the most important things that we can do to support educator well-being is to frequently revisit our why in terms of why is this important to us? Why is this work? Why did I begin this work in the first place?
And not the cliche, remember your why that leaders do on a tough year, but more of just like providing them relevancy of this is why, whether it be like, this is why we chose this curriculum. This is why we chose, this is why we're doing what we're doing with this. Or I always felt it was really helpful when leaders would provide us data around, here's where our students are struggling in this area. So this is why we're going to implement this strategy or this initiative. And it was really helpful because it gave me context. It gave me purpose behind the things that I was being asked to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I absolutely love this conversation. And I want to ask a little bit about, you talked about Harmony Education or Harmony Academy and the things that you're doing. Where do educators start with this kind of work? What could an individual teacher do versus what could a leader do with some of the work that Harmony Academy is doing?
Well, thanks for asking that. And I, I think there's so many different approaches that one could take, and it certainly is not a one size fits all. Because what it looks like at one school is going to look different than what it looks like. Of course, we have this like ideal, if you were going to use the program with fidelity, here are our recommendations. But I think ultimately, like leaders, teachers, they understand the context and need of their students and communities more than we do. So we certainly always, I think, start by understanding what is the context. And so typically, and that's where I think I have the best job in the world, even though teaching is pretty amazing up there working directly with the students. But I get to work with educators, leaders, and teachers, honestly, like all around the world. And it's pretty cool because you see how many people there are out there that are passionate about helping equip kids with these skills, right? So to start, like, where do we start? I mean, particularly the Harmony curriculum is available at no cost digitally. We do also, if schools are interested in purchasing physical curriculum kits, they can certainly go that route. We also have other offerings to kind of like leverage or level up your implementation. But ultimately, the curriculum itself is available digitally at no cost. And so that's where I say one of the places you can start is just by checking it out. So as I said, we have what is my favorite, our everyday practices, which are intended. We have what we call Harmony goals, which is creating collective goals in the classroom about how we want to be with one another and how we want to treat one another and how we want to feel when we're in the classroom, led by the student's voice. Throughout the curriculum, students are also given the opportunity to create their own goals and then regularly be given the opportunity to reflect back upon, like, how are they doing with the goals that they set for themselves, right? We also have, like I had mentioned earlier, the meetup, which is our version of a circle time, which again, in an ideal world, sure, it'd be great if teachers took, the Harmony curriculum and they said, oh, okay, I'm going to be able to integrate all of the steps Harmony has into my meetup or my circle time or whatever it is that they call it. And then, if they were able to do that, they'd be very intentional about bringing out those social and emotional skills during that time. But also I would say that there's flexibility there and understanding that it might look different in one class versus another. And so we do try to provide spaces for autonomy throughout the trainings that we provide. And then also we have what we call Buddy Up, which is a daily opportunity for students to pair up and they do some sort of fun, collaborative, or get to know you exercise with the same student. And then the idea being the next week it's a new student. And then every week, they're having the opportunity to partner and be intentional about it. So I would just say, again, like going back to this word of intentional, Harmony is a resource that educators can use to, I'm going to say, like, turn up the volume on helping students get these social emotional skills by having some resources that are very intentional. So I would say to get started specifically with Harmony is go to our website and check it out. So, go to harmonyacademy.org and check out what we have to do. You can sign up for an account with no cost, and that gives you full access to the digital curriculum. We provide ongoing training. So myself or some of my other implementation specialist colleagues, we provide almost every day some sort of like training that anybody can sign up for nationally and internationally. And then we also do provide site specific training to schools who'd be interested in like adopting it on a school wide
Yeah.
level. And then, so that's like, the everyday practices are intended to be done in tandem with the weekly lessons that we have. Each lesson focuses on and targets a specific skill, for example, growth mindset, right? Or, just essentially self-awareness, anything associated with like this idea of like, what are the things that we can do to be our best selves, and how can we work better with one another, and how can we problem solve with one another. And then another really amazing resource that I absolutely love about Harmony Academy is that, and available when you sign up for the free account, is you actually have access to Harmony Professional Learning, which is our professional learning platform. It has over 80 self-paced modules that I can't even tell you. They cover a variety of different resources, and the whole point of it is that they're meant for the teachers to do them for themselves, right? So, like for example, there's an entire interpersonal topic is one of the topics in there, and there's lessons about how do we as teachers cope with stress, how do we as teachers practice self-compassion. That is just one example. So like, while some of them are very focused on that, there's other modules that are about like, how do I write better formative assessments, or how do I like do more formative assessments in my classroom, or how do I be mindful about building better relationships with my students or with the families I work with. So there's a variety of different modules that I recommend that educators try out, and part of that is us recognizing that like, we can't expect teachers to be doing this work unless we're also giving back to the teachers and helping them build the knowledge and skills they need right alongside the students. So my hope is that those modules are really seen as like a healing balm for teachers, where they can go and just spend some time developing themselves and learning themselves, right? Taking time for themselves. Rather than always having to be focused on the students. Though we know we're doing this for the students, but we can become our best teachers when we also take time to focus on our own development as well.
Yeah. I think that's what when we first talked, I really loved that there's that option for adults or for teachers, because I do think oftentimes we talk about like the resources to use with students, but even just like, it's really hard to talk about conflict resolution or self-compassion with students when it's like, do I know how to do that myself? Right.
Right.
Like those
Right.
kind of things. And I think providing that opportunity is really helpful. I mean, we kind of joked at the beginning of this conversation about, oh, don't forget to do self-care. Part of that self-care for adults is doing that own interpersonal work. And like, it's hard to find opportunities to do that in different ways. And, in this particular way, it relates to your job. It can be helpful. And even just that professional development opportunities are really helpful, even especially if the teachers get a choice in what they get to do. And so I think that can be really helpful.
Definitely. And I've seen some really successful models of that, where the building leaders, or even at the district level, like, they provide the time and space for educators to
Yeah.
go and choose, like, what are some of the particular modules you'd be interested in doing, and then have some sort of like meaningful professional learning community based around the module that the educator is interested in learning about. Or we also provide coaching guides along with each module. So let's say that, as an instructional coach, as a former instructional coach, I was tasked with like giving professional development, right, to like multiple schools often. And, we encourage leaders and instructional coaches that are interested in using our Harmony Professional Learning to take these coaching guides and then make these modules their own. Turnkey them into a professional development that you are delivering to teachers in the building. So again, I want to point out, that we do encourage that flexibility in hopes that Harmony is really a resource and a tool where educators feel they can go to fill that gap, maybe when they don't have the resources that they feel like they always need. Which I don't know about you, but I felt that way quite often when I was teaching.
Well, especially I think in different types of schools or different, depends on your structure, but there are a lot of times where it's like, I had to figure out how to do this on my own. And, even just having the opportunity to learn learn something at my own pace, or even to choose to self-identify areas where I needed to work would be really helpful. And I know I've worked in a district where, we had to complete 7 hours of professional development outside of our contract time to kind of like get a
Right.
day off in the spring or something.
Right.
And so to be able to have an option of like, here's a great opportunity for those professional development is so helpful. So I definitely am excited to share that with our listeners and to share more about Harmony. So in that idea of providing, strong SEL practices for educators and students, what would you hope that leaders maybe listening take away from our conversation?
So another piece of advice that I have seen work beautifully in schools with faculties and staffs, actually, again, all around the nation and even in some other countries, is when principals start adopting some of the everyday practices that we have as part of the Harmony curriculum with their faculty. So not only does that really help with buy-in with the use of the curriculum with the students, because the faculty is having the opportunity to practice it. But it also then builds relationships and community within the faculty and staff, right? So I would say, if there were a leader out there that's feeling like, I need to really do some things to help my teachers feel like, build community within my faculty or staff, I honestly would encourage them to say, okay, go practice a buddy up with them during every faculty meeting, or practice a meetup. Talk to your student or talk to your teachers about, what are some of their goals and how can you support their goals? And maybe those goals are beyond specifically teaching in the context, right? So this idea that if we're expecting teachers to treat our students like whole children, right? So this whole child education approach of us supporting and nurturing the whole child, I think that we also as leaders then need to consider that educators are the same. And so it's who is the whole educator and what is the support that they need, recognizing that it's beyond just who they are as teachers within the classroom.
Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you. This is a fantastic conversation, and I think much needed, in just talking about the, how this is like, I don't know, just sort of like leveling up what you do with your social emotional skills and social skills curriculum, or even just practices that you do within the school. And so I appreciate you coming and chatting about this. This is a really fun conversation, and hopefully our leaders can take away something to think about and gnaw on this week. So we will definitely share all of the Harmony Academy information and links in the show notes so that
Great,
everyone can
thank
kind
you.
of check that out.
And I really want to let you know, again, I have the best job in the sense of I get to connect with educators all around the nation and the world, and really mean it when I say, like, we're genuinely interested in connecting. And so, if there's a leader out there or a teacher out there that's interested in learning more, I encourage you, to reach out, and somebody from our organization will reach back out and say, okay, how can we help you? How can we support you? What do you need?
Yeah. Well, and here at Branching Minds, we love Harmony. I think we've integrated some of the everyday practices within our resource library. So it's really fun to be able to partner with you guys. So
wonderful. We appreciate the partnership too. Thank you for all you're doing as well.
Thanks for listening to Schoolin' Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. Go ahead and subscribe to our feed wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, if you are enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcast on iTunes? This helps others find our podcast and lets us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn at Branching Minds.